So some people have been asking me about this little wireframe shader that I've been using at the start of my beginner Blender modeling tutorial series, and so I thought I'd just go through and explain how this is pulled off because it's pretty straightforward. It just requires a little bit of work with some drivers, but it's not too bad. And yeah, let's get right into it and I'll step you guys through how to do all this. So let's just go ahead, delete the camera and the light, and we're just going to build the shader on the cube just because we know the scale is correct. It's not rotated strangely or anything. It's just going to make it easier to work with, right? So first of all, I'm just going to move it 1 unit up on the Z just so it's sitting above the grid, just easier to see. And then tab into edit mode, and I'm going to subdivide this 10 times. That's completely arbitrary, but just think about it, right? We're making a shader that's based on a wireframe, so the more edges we have, the more that's visible for the wireframe, so that's why I'm doing that. Then last thing we want, just to get the setup ready, is let's just go ahead and bring in an empty, and let's go with single arrow, and I'm just going to drag that out a little bit on the X here just so we can see it. So let's go into our shading tab, just going to switch over to cycles, and first of all, let's go ahead, delete the principled, and bring in a texture coordinates node, and we can also get a mapping node, plug the object into the vector, and then we can get a gradient node, or gradient texture I should say, sorry. And then we'll get a color ramp. And plug the color into the factorial. And then we can preview that here. Cool. So the idea of what we're going for here, I'm just going to enable my move gizmo, is that we want this arrow here to be able to influence the scale, location, and rotation of the gradient on the cube here. So to start out, something we need to fix is that our arrow is pointing up on the Z-axis and this is facing along the X-axis, which is due in part to the rotation on the Y-axis. So first thing I want to do is let's select our arrow, press N to bring up the N panel, and in the Y rotation here, I just want you to right click on that and copy as a new driver. Then coming back over to the mapping node in the rotation, right click on the Y and we'll go paste driver. And then we can go edit the driver. So something we need to change here is let's change this from an average value to a scripted expression, sorry. And I'll just show you something quickly here. If we go ahead and rotate this on the Y, you'll notice that the rotation is 1, inverse to where we're pointing the arrow, and 2, it's completely offset by about 90 degrees, right? So we need to fix both of those. So let's firstly address the inverse rotation. So all we can do is put a negative sign in the front, and then as we rotate, you'll notice it actually follows the same direction of the rotation that we're doing. Next, what we'll do to address the offset, let's go edit driver again, and what we'll do is we'll go plus pi divided by 2, and that will flip it up by, I don't know, a radian or whatever. I was never very good at math and all that, but it rotates it that amount. I think there's a little bit of an offset because of a rounding error, but now it's oriented the same way as our empty arrow there. Cool. So now if we rotate this on the Y, it properly reflects the direction that the arrow is facing, which is cool. Nice and responsive. Next thing I want to do is let's have it so that as we move this arrow along the Z-axis, it will also influence the gradient here. So let's go ahead, we'll set up this one manually. Let's go add driver to the Z location. We'll change the expression to just say var. We'll change the object to the empty, because that's our arrow. And let's change the type to Z location, okay? And then if we go and move our arrow, nothing happens. So why is that? Well, the Z location isn't the actual thing that we want to be moving here, because to my understanding, the vector nodes are working in 2D spaces. I believe I could be completely wrong in this capacity. I am not that smart when it comes to all the vector math stuff. But what we want to do instead is we want to adjust the location based on the X-axis, because you notice if I modify this, it gives us the desired result of moving it up and down. So I'll just set that back to 0. So let's do the same thing. So let's go add a driver, just change the expression to just say var, and the object can be our empty, and we'll set the type to the Z location. And one thing I already know, much like the Y rotation, we just need to set this to say negative var. I've got no idea why, but if we don't do that, then as we push this up, the gradient will actually go down. So that's pretty cool. So we can push that up, we can rotate it along the Y axis. It's all looking pretty good here. So the only other thing we'd need to do is be able to add in some rotations to do on the other axes. So we can rotate on the Y, but we can't yet rotate on the X. So you can probably guess how we're going to accomplish that. I'm just going to set the Z back down to 0. So what we'll do is go to the X rotation with our arrow selected, right click and copy as a new driver. And then we can just go ahead and paste that as a driver into our rotation, edit it, change from average value to a scripted expression, and we will make that a negative rotation. So now if we rotate along the X, it also follows along there as well. Cool. The final thing, you wouldn't guess it, but we're going to do the Z rotation. So copy as a new driver, and let's go ahead and paste that into the Z rotation, and once again change from average value to scripted expression and make that negative. Cool, so now we can rotate on the Y, we can rotate along the Z axes, and it would seem that the Z axis doesn't actually need to be negative. So edit driver, positive. Cool. I can't explain why that's the case, I've got no idea, it doesn't make any sense to me, but it works, I can see that it works, and that's what's important, okay? So there we go. Awesome. Now, the final thing that I want to do is let's just get the scale in there. So I'm going to use the Z scale for this. So just going to go ahead and copy the Z scale from the empty arrow as a driver. And then in our scale here, I'm just going to go ahead and... No, it's not going to be the Z, sorry, because we discussed that. Oh no, it is the Z in this instance. That's even more confusing because the location's in the X and the scale's in the Z. Cool, that makes no sense at all. Anyway, let's paste that as a driver. And then as we go ahead and scale this, it will adjust the intensity of our gradient. So cool, now we've got a lot of control over the way our gradient works. And the reason I set this up is because the way I used the shader in the past was I'd go through and just animate these manually and set up keyframes. I just think it's so much nicer to be able to do it like this. It just makes working with it so much easier. So anyway, now that that's set up, that's the basic driving principle behind the shader. Now what we can do is we can get to the fun part where we can make it look a little bit more visually entertaining. So first things first, let's get the wireframe effect in because that's what you've all come here for. So let's go to our modifiers, and what we're going to do is we're going to chuck in a bevel modifier. Now I only learnt about this just today doing a little bit of research about some wireframes, but pretty much what we do is we get a bevel, we set the amount down to something low. So yeah, we'll set the amount to something low, and we don't want to limit the method to anything. We just want to bevel absolutely everything here, okay? So the next thing we want to do, so we've got this material set up, so let's just call this like wireframe, M key. And we'll go ahead, we'll add another material, we'll push it to the top of the stack here, and I'll just leave it as this basic principled BSDF shader. In the bevel shader, we just want to change the material index from -1 to 1, and in edit mode, we just want to go ahead and assign this new material. And what you'll see now is that the gradient is being applied only to the wireframe parts of our mesh, which is pretty cool. And you know, you'll be able to see that also reflected as we start to move our empty arrow there. So this is good, but I'm not really stoked with where it's sitting, and also it's consistent. So like as soon as we bring that down below the 0 point or like the grid floor in the world, it will just continue on making it white. It doesn't look that amazing, right? So what I'd like to do instead, and what I've done for the animations that I've shown off, is that in the color ramp here, let's just go grab this white value, and I'm going to change its position to 0.5, and we'll go add in another little dot here, and we'll bring this all the way to position 1, and we'll change its color to be completely black. And I just find this is a little bit more interesting because as I move this around, it just reveals part of the wireframe. Admittedly, we can still see the other parts that are grayed out, but we'll address that in just a moment. Also, something you can do, because this isn't in the middle, right? Like the gradient isn't sitting in the middle. What we can do is we can come to the location driver, and with our expression, we've got -var. We can also just subtract 0.5 from it. Add 0.5 from it in this case. And now it sits in the middle, which I just find makes a little bit more sense because it looks more reflective of the way we've got the color ramp set up, right? Cool, so the next thing we can do, we can go ahead and get a RGB node, and then we can get a mix node, or mix color node, plug these together, and let's set this to multiply, factor of 1, and then this is how you can give it some color. So I normally use like a bright orange sort of look in the renders that I've done, so something like that. But at the moment this doesn't actually make any sense shader wise because we've got a color output going into a shader input. So let's just fix that and let's bring in an emission node. I'm going to crank this up to 12 to make it glow a little bit more. And so now you see you're getting that nice effect where you're getting like the white hot in the middle, and then as it reaches more to the edge you're starting to get more of the color. And you can always change the type of the gradient here, so we can go ahead, change this to easing, change this to ease, and then you sort of just get a little bit more fade, a less of a harsh cutoff between the white hot part and the orange part. And you can also change that further, if we go ahead and scale our arrow down, it'll increase the scale of the wireframe so we can get more autonomy over modifying it to the way we want it to be. But something I'm not a fan of here, and actually I'm just going to go ahead and load in an HDRI. I'll just set that to be transparent. So we can still see the other parts of the wireframe, which I don't really like. It kind of reveals what we're trying to slowly reveal in a dramatic sort of way. So what we can do for this is if we just go ahead and get a mix shader, we can use the color of our color ramp here as the factorial. And then we can go ahead and get a transparent shader, plug that into the bottom socket, and that has not worked, so let's flip these around. Cool. Alright, so this may not look like it's worked either, but it has. So I can promise you if we zoom in here, all of these wires are now transparent, but it does introduce a different issue where we can actually see through the mesh. And the way we're going to focus on this later, that's not going to be a problem. But what we can do in the short run is we can just go ahead and, if I can move this, duplicate our shader. And we'll get a geometry node. And with this, we're going to use the back-facing output, plug it into our mix shader as the factorial, and then we can just plug the transparency into the bottom node there. But now we won't see the... we won't see the glow from the other side leak through onto this side. So, this is cool and all, and the effect works. The problem is, if you wanted to render things out the way I have for those intros, this is not going to work. And I'll explain why, and I'll do it with a practical example here. Just get rid of this. So I'm just going to bring in this helmet that I've been working on. And this is good for a few reasons, because it's several objects. But it's also a hard surface object, so a lot of rounded surfaces and everything. And if we try to replicate the same effect, so first and foremost, I'm just going to go ahead... Actually, no, I'll keep the materials on this. So let's just go ahead, I'll just show you what the problem is here. I'm just going to turn off that subdiv so it doesn't destroy my laptop. And let's do the same thing. Let's get a bevel modifier, set the limit method to none, and we'll put the amount to like 0.001. So the problem with this is, even if we render a wireframe over the top of this, right, so we can go down here, I'm just going to get rid of two of these materials, add one in, wireframe, and we'll do the same thing as before. We'll just go shading, material index of 1. Cool. So you can probably see the problem here, right? So I've got this nice model and we've got the wireframe on it, but now it's all jagged with all the faces because we are beveling every single face that's apparent here, right? So what I prefer to do in this situation is sort of do a little bit of a different setup here. So we're still going to use the same logic. We're just going to do some stuff with the compositor and our view layers. So I'm just going to change our view layer here to main. I'm going to duplicate that and make a new one. And I'm just going to call this wire because this will be where our wireframe comes in. And I'm just going to turn off the original collection that we use the cube with because that's going to interfere with what we're doing otherwise. So what I'm going to do is we're going to have a few meshes set up. So I'm just going to get rid of the wireframe on this and I'm going to get rid of the bevel. Okay, and I'll turn my subdiv on so that we get a nice hard surface mesh. So that looks nice. What we're going to do is I'm going to select all of the parts of this helmet here, and I'm just going to go Shift D, take a second because of the subdivs, And I'm going to move these to a new collection, and I'm just going to call this new collection Wire. Okay, so create that. And we want to hide or disable the wire collection in our main layer. But if we come over to the wire here, we pretty much want to do the opposite. So we want to hide the main helmet, and then we want to set this helmet up to be just the wireframes, okay? A trick that I like to do is having a hard surface model that doesn't yet have a normal map baked to it, so it's not yet been converted to a low poly mesh. If you want to have it as a high poly model, but with the low poly wireframe over the top of it, this works really well because we aren't going to have the meshes intersect so much. We're just going to have them layered over the top of each other in the compositor. So what I like to do is, let's just set the subdivision to 1, so there's going to be a complete mismatch between the high poly and this version. So yeah, we've stripped all these down to just one subdivision now, so the topology is a little bit simpler, the wireframes will look nicer. And now we can go ahead and we can set up the wireframe material here, and we can get the bevel going here, so offset none, set this to 0.001, and the shading, and we'll set the material index to 1, and so now we can see this. Actually, I might actually take the subdivision off. I think that just looked a little bit too much, just for this. Yeah, I think that looks nice, a little bit simpler. What we want to do is we don't actually want to have the same material. We actually want to get rid of this, and we'll make a new material, push it to the top of the stack again, and we can just call this transparent because that's what it will be. And we'll just change the surface to be a transparent shader. And I'm just going to assign the transparent shader here. You can then overlay this to the main render here in the compositor. So we'll just go through and set up the rest of this because there's one more step that we need to do. And this is actually about to show a decent example of something. So I'm just going to go ahead and select the other meshes that I haven't yet applied the material or modifier to. Just go Control L, link materials, Control L, and copy modifiers. So now if I render that, it's all set up. So there's a problem here, right? The wireframe is all over the place. It's not synchronized between all the meshes. So there's a few limitations with this shader model that I've set up. If you rotate it too much, it sort of cracks the shits and just doesn't work properly anymore. I'm not smart enough with vector math to figure that out, so if somebody is much smarter than me, please by all means take it and prove it and make it better. I've got no idea. I spent 2 hours trying to figure it out and had no luck. But another thing is that it won't work for separate objects that are all supposed to be a part of the one object. So simple fix here, all I'm going to do is just select everything, Control J, join it to a singular mesh, and now it will all work because everything's working off of the same origin point. Technically, yes, you could then just go ahead and set the origin point for all the individual meshes to be the same. I just think joining them is a bit of a simpler process. Anyway, we've got one more step here, so let's just go ahead and duplicate this mesh. We'll move, make a new collection, and we'll call this cull. Right, and what I'm going to do with this is I'm just going to get rid of the bevel, and I'm just going to get rid of all the shaders on it because we don't want any real interference. But what we're going to do here is with this cull is just open our filters here. Let's turn on the holdout view, and we're going to make the cull collection a holdout. But there's a bit of a problem here. It's clipping with our wireframe. So what we want to do is if we just go ahead and select the mesh that's in the cull collection there, we'll just tab into edit mode, A to select everything. I'm just going to go Alt and S and then just press down once on my arrow keys, and that just slightly truncates the mesh just so it's not doing any Z fighting or anything. So there we go, and what we can do now is I'm just going to set up a camera just very quickly and cheaply. Also the cull layer is in our main, so just make sure you toggle that off so it's not visible. And so let's just very quickly set up a camera here because I don't want this to take too long for you guys. Probably already taken longer than it should have, but I just wanted to make sure I explained everything. Let's go ahead and render. Cool, so with that rendered, let's go to our compositing tab here. And if we just bring in a viewer node, we can see what we're working with. Alright, so let's duplicate our render layers here. Bring this down. And let's change this from main to wire. And what we're going to do is use an alpha over. Oops, sorry, not a set alpha, alpha over. And we'll plug the wire into the bottom input. And now you can see we've nicely overlaid our wireframe onto our mesh. And as I said, it's fantastic because we've got to use the high poly mesh, but we're showing the low poly wireframes. So we get the best of both worlds in visual presentation there. And then quite simply what we can do to just add a little bit more flair to everything and just make it look a little bit nicer, which is typically what I do when I've rendered these out, is just go ahead, add a glare node. And I think the bloom looks pretty nice. It's pretty intense, so you might need to tone it down a little bit. So you can just adjust the mix factor here. But yeah, there you go. That's how I've been doing those little wireframe animations. And then obviously if you wanted to animate it, I think you guys would have picked up on the fact that, it'd just be a matter of, I'm just going to move this into the helmet example. It'd just be a matter of, setting a keyframe location here, and then, go to the end of the timeline, bring this up however much, animate it again, and then it will give you a nice little, I'm not going to be able to see it there, am I? But then, you'll get a little animated wireframe. Obviously this one I'd need to adjust because the helmet's in a different position. But yeah, there you go. I hope you guys found this useful. Sorry that it ran a little bit longer than expected, and I will see you all in the next one.